Spoiler warning before we get into this. If you have not seen the latest episode of Succession yet, please fast forward about 10 to 15 minutes and we'll meet you there. I also know that not everyone is watching Succession.
Also, if you don't care about what happens on Succession, you can stay with us.
Yes, because this conversation is not actually about Succession. It's about a theme that came from the most recent episode. This is your last spoiler warning, so go.
Shoo, off you go.
On Monday, episode 3 of season 4 of Succession dropped, titled Connor's Wedding. It was not really about Connor's wedding. What it was really was one of the most interesting depictions of death and grief that I've seen on screen. The death itself was one that we always knew was coming, but as we all know, death being inevitable doesn't mean it's not a shock. And in the episode, Logan Roy, who's essentially the Rupert Murdoch-esque founder and CEO of
the patriarch
of the fictional business Waystar Royco, dies suddenly in a private plane on the way to a business meeting. He has a heart attack and he's basically in the bathroom of the private plane, is having chest pain and then becomes unconscious. And his son-in-law, Tom, calls Logan's adult kids and they're given the opportunity to say goodbye to their dad, who they have a very complicated relationship with, when he's probably already gone. And it's a fascinating episode of television. Once we get to the death, everything happens in real time. Like 1 minute of Succession time is 1 minute of real world time.
So one take.
Yes, one take. There's a 29-minute take in there that's just all in one go. And what it shows that I don't think I've seen on screen before is the uncertainty of death and the complicated way a death unfolds, particularly now in the time of iPhones and technology, because we're all connected to each other. So a generation ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, you would learn that somebody had died. Now that doesn't happen. You learn somebody's not doing well, somebody's had a heart attack, they appear to be unconscious. You actually get play-by-plays of what's unfolding, which is incredibly confusing, and you get conflicting information, not because anybody's acting maliciously, but just because that's what happens in a crisis. And that's what happens. And the kids react in 4 really unique ways. One's in complete denial and says, we don't know he's dead until his doctor confirms it once they land. Another goes straight to logistics. Who's the best plane doctor? Let me speak to the pilot. I need to get on a Zoom call. Another one is a mixture of catatonic with grief and angry because her brothers got to speak to their dad first and she was late to the room and she's worried he didn't get to hear what she said. And the last sibling, who is a bit of the forgotten sibling, he has this moment of shock when he finds out and he simply says, he never even liked me. So he has this moment of profound honesty. And I just thought it was fascinating because this is how death plays out in 2023. There's uncertainty, there's news and then compounding news, and there's confusion, it's mundane, and you don't really get the relief or closure that TV and movies have told us that we get. Elfie, why do you think people cannot stop talking about this episode?
It was, well, for a start, I think the acting, the way that it was shot was remarkable. Just as a piece of standalone television, it was incredible. I also think that what we saw reflected on screen was an experience that I imagine many of us have had. And it captured it in such a realistic way that I think it was really difficult to turn away from. Like, what really struck me mostly was the idea that these are like the most powerful people in the world, supposedly like the wealthiest of the wealthy. And yet in those moments, they were completely disempowered by this news. There was nothing that they could do. And I think that ultimately, like, that's the most interesting part, is that you felt like you could relate to them properly, probably for the first time in the entire series so far. And also, I do think that just in general, portrayals of death on screen and grief are so important because we are very repressed about talking about really difficult topics like this. And I think we find it difficult to connect even to our closest friends when they're going through something like this. So yeah, it was a really just magnetizing kind of episode that you couldn't look away from. And I think that that's why everybody's talking about it now.
I think you're right that we don't see these really gritty depictions of death. Often death is used as a plot point just to propel the plot forward. In this episode, the death was the story. The unfolding of the death was the story. And that's what happens in real life. You very rarely get a phone call from someone saying so-and-so suddenly died. It's news that unfolds, and there is confusion and conflicting information that makes it really complicated to process.
I think that obviously depends on how close to the person you are. Like, I mean, you do get phone calls saying that people have died, obviously. But
probably the people closest to you.
Yes, exactly. You'll be more informed of their progress. Now, I famously said last week I don't watch Succession, and this week I've felt more on the outer than ever before because it literally is all anyone's talking about. But clearly this, whenever there's a really meaningful death in TV drama, it turns the conversation for quite some time. And I was thinking about this a lot this week because I also read this piece on Mamamia that our friend and colleague Nicole Stewart wrote about her dad dying recently. And she wrote a piece about how she's 34 and she's, lived a life of various, levels of loss. But the loss of her father has hit her in such a profound way. Of course it has. But the thing that I found really interesting in what she said, which is so true, is she wrote about how I've stood by friends as they've said goodbye to loved ones. I've attended funerals of acquaintances out of respect, shed a few tears and eaten some sandwiches and then gotten on with my day and my life. And the thing is that's what everybody does. And it's what you need to do in order to keep moving forward, because we all know that everybody dies and you can't be poleaxed out about every time. But that's what everybody does until a death that hits you so hard and so close to home that normal life can't be resumed. And that is something that's reserved for people in your life who their daily absence will leave an enormous hole. And I know, Claire, Jessie's talked on this show about your family suffering several of those losses over the past year, for your mum in particular. And I think the fact that it's such a universal experience, but so little discussed, and even in Nicole's piece, she talked about how it's a club that no one wants to be a part of, but ultimately it's a club that everybody's going to be part of, is really interesting. Like, we're still not comfortable to discuss it and to talk about the actual process of it.
Nicole also says in that piece that the people who reach out, like, you're part of a club you didn't ask to be a part of, you don't want to be a part of it. And the people who reach out are really surprising and seem a little bit random. And what struck me about this episode was the people who are good in that situation are surprising. And that's what you find when you go through a crisis moment in life. You don't know how anyone's going to act or who is going to be the person who instinctually knows what to do until you're in it. And in this episode, it's the brother-in-law who thinks to call and put the phone next to Logan's ear, which is quite a empathetic, compassionate thing to do and not logical at all. Because
particularly
it's like
for the characters on that show.
Yeah,
but it's so tender.
Yeah.
That made my heart hurt. That bit. Yeah.
And it's something, you see these people as vicious business people who are just constantly competing, and to see that was his instinct was fascinating, because that's what you see when you have these moments. You're incredibly surprised by the person who will just have an idea or a gesture that you think, oh my God, you really get it in quite a beautiful way.
And how everybody reacts differently. When we lost Brent's mum, there were 5 of us in the room. We were all so, like, the siblings, everyone was so different in the way that they processed it and what happened. And like, it was just, it's a moment that you can't prepare for. And except on TV, which you can prepare for. I have read, even though I'm not a Succession person, about how they've kept this secret, because it is a massive, massive plot point. And I don't know how they keep anything secret. But they kept Brian Cox turning up to filming throughout even though his character had died. He came to his own funeral. came to his own funeral shoot so that the paps would be confused about who's died if he's in there. And it was very clever.
And apparently
Very
they
clever.
had, I think the code word in the writer's room was Larry David. So they would just say like, in this episode, blah, 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 Connor's wedding, Larry David. And that was Logan's death. And so that's how people on the outside didn't know. But I think probably the cast and even the extras, because all the extras knew who were there for that episode. And there were so many extras because it was a wedding. They clearly all knew the stakes of this in television land, that you just did not want to be the person who ruined it.
Those NDAs must have been watertight.
Yes.
So this is only episode 3. And obviously, like, this was teased in the very first episode of the very first season, right? Because that's the point of Succession. So how many have we got to go, like, to see what happens? Because this is the last one, right?
Yeah. 7 episodes.
Very bold.
Left. But once you see this unfold and you see when it happened, it is very, even though you're right, it's been inevitable since the first episode, it's still a shock how and when it happened and all the circumstances around why. Like, he was on a plane when he might have been at his son's wedding under different circumstances, might have been able to get medical attention. I'm sure that'll all come out. But it really kind of rams that idea that it still feels random and cruel, even if you know it's coming. But now we have 7 episodes to see the fallout. And I think the emotions and the grief and how it manifests in different people will be fascinating.
Sorry for the spoilers.
Yeah. Soft.